Marcus Reeves stood in the boardroom, his tie perfectly knotted, his portfolio worth $12 million sitting comfortably in offshore accounts, and his voice, steady, measured, about to destroy everything he'd spent 15 years building. "I'm resigning from the board," he said, sliding his nameplate across the mahogany table toward Julian Cross, the CEO who'd made him wealthy beyond imagination. "And I'm taking the severance files with me." Julian's expression barely flickered, but the room had already gone cold. Outside the glass walls, 347 employees typed at their desks, unaware that the man who owned 8% of the company had just chosen them over his own fortune. Marcus had never intended to be a hero. He'd intended to be exactly what he became: rich, comfortable, and insulated from the kind of desperation he'd grown up with in South Boston. The son of a factory worker and a home health aide, he'd clawed his way through state school on scholarships in spite, then into finance, then into venture capital, and finally onto the board of Cross Technologies, a mid-sized logistics software firm that had exploded in value over the past decade. Julian Cross, the founder and CEO, was brilliant, ruthless, and magnetic in the way that made investors feel invincible. Marcus had admired him, trusted him, built wealth alongside him. That was before the email. It arrived on a Tuesday morning in late September, forwarded from an anonymous account with the subject line, "You should see this." Inside were spreadsheets, internal memos, and a list of names. 219 employees marked for termination by the end of the quarter. Not layoffs due to performance, not restructuring for efficiency. This was something else. The terminations were concentrated in 3 departments: quality assurance, customer support, and compliance. The employees flagged were disproportionately over 40, disproportionately women, and disproportionately those who'd raised concerns about safety protocols in the company's new automated delivery systems. The memos were clinical. High-risk retention profiles, optimize for output per dollar, limit liability exposure. Marcus read it twice, then called his assistant and cleared his afternoon. He spent the rest of the day cross-referencing the names with HR records, performance reviews, and incident reports. Every employee on the list had filed at least one formal complaint in the past 18 months. Some had flagged software glitches that delayed shipments. Others had reported repetitive stress injuries from warehouse systems. 3 had requested accommodations under the ADA. None had been fired for cause. They were simply being erased. By Thursday, Marcus had scheduled a private meeting with Julian. They met in Julian's corner office, floor-to-ceiling windows framing the skyline like a throne room. Julian poured them both scotch, smiled that easy smile, and asked what was on Marcus's mind. Marcus slid a printed copy of the termination list across the desk. "Tell me this isn't real," he said. Julian didn't flinch. He leaned back, took a sip, and said, "It's necessary." "Necessary for what?" "Growth, margins, investor confidence. You know how this works, Marcus. We're not a non-profit. These employees are liabilities. They slow us down. They cost us money. They create risk. We're positioning for acquisition talks next spring. We can't afford dead weight." "They're not dead weight. They're people who did their jobs and asked questions. And now they're people we don't need." Julian set his glass down, his expression hardening. "You've been on this board long enough to understand the game. Sentiment doesn't scale. You want to keep your portfolio intact? Then you keep your head down and let me run the company." Marcus left that office with his hands shaking and his mind made up. He didn't sleep that night. Instead, he pulled every file he had access to, every document that outlined the termination strategy, every memo that revealed the intent. He copied them onto an encrypted drive. Then he started making calls. The first was to Alana Bryce, a labor attorney he'd met years ago at a fundraiser. She listened in silence as he explained what he'd found, then asked a single question: "Are you willing to go on record?" Marcus hesitated. Going on record meant lawsuits, investigations, media exposure. It meant burning every bridge he had in the industry. It also meant the difference between 200 people losing their livelihoods and 200 people keeping them. Yes, he said. The second call was to David Tran, a former compliance officer who'd been quietly let go 6 months earlier after raising alarms about the delivery system's accident rates. David had been one of the names on the list, terminated early before the purge had even been formalized. He was now working part-time at a hardware store and taking online courses to retrain. When Marcus reached him, he was cautious, guarded. "Why are you calling me?" he asked. "Because you were right, and because I want to fix this." David was silent for a long time. Then, quietly, "What do you need?" By the following Monday, Marcus had compiled a dossier that included testimony from 12 former employees, internal communications from Julian and the executive team, and a forensic breakdown of the termination list. He'd also hired a public relations consultant who specialized in whistleblower cases. The plan was simple: file a complaint with the labor board, leak the story to an investigative journalist, and force the company into a settlement before the firings could proceed. It was risky, it was expensive, and it would cost Marcus everything he'd built. On Wednesday morning, Marcus walked into the boardroom for the quarterly meeting. Julian was already seated at the head of the table, flanked by the CFO and general counsel. The other board members filtered in: venture capitalists, former executives, people who'd made fortunes alongside Marcus and had no reason to question the status quo. Marcus took his seat, opened his briefcase, and set a folder on the table in front of him. Julian started the meeting with the usual pleasantries, then moved into the quarterly report. Revenue was up, margins were strong, investor interest was mounting. Everything looked perfect on paper. Then Marcus spoke. "Before we move forward," he said, his voice calm, "I'd like to address the planned terminations outlined in the October Workforce Optimization Memo." The room went still. Julian's eyes locked onto Marcus, cold and unblinking. "That's an internal matter, not a board issue." "It is when it exposes the company to a class action lawsuit," I replied. He opened the folder and pulled out copies of the dossier, sliding them across the table to each board member. "These terminations violate federal labor protections. They target employees who raised safety concerns, requested accommodations, or otherwise exercised their rights. If this proceeds, we're looking at litigation, regulatory investigations, and reputational damage that will kill any acquisition deal." One of the board members, Patricia Kim, who is a former COO, scanned the first page, her expression darkening. "Is this accurate?" "It's a mischaracterization," Julian said quickly. "These are standard workforce adjustments based on performance metrics and operational needs." "Then why are 83% of the flagged employees over 40? Why are 70% women? And why does every single one of them have a documented complaint on file?" He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The numbers spoke for themselves. The room erupted in questions. Julian tried to regain control, but the damage was done. Marcus had handed them a liability they couldn't ignore. By the end of the meeting, Julian had agreed to suspend the terminations pending a third-party review. Marcus knew it was a stalling tactic. Julian would regroup, reframe, and push forward as soon as the heat died down. That's why Marcus had already set the next phase in motion. That afternoon, a reporter from a national business publication received an encrypted email containing the full dossier, corroborated testimony, and a signed statement from Marcus Reeves. The story broke 3 days later. "Tech exec turns whistleblower to stop mass firings," the headline read. By Monday, the labor board had opened an investigation, and Cross Technologies' stock had dropped 9%. Marcus's phone rang nonstop. Investors demanding explanations, former colleagues calling him a traitor, journalists asking for interviews. He ignored most of them. The only call he answered was from David Tran, who said simply, "Thank you." But the real fight was just beginning. The lawsuit came fast. Julian and the executive team filed a countersuit against Marcus within a week, alleging breach of fiduciary duty, theft of proprietary information, and defamation. The message was clear. Marcus had declared war, and they intended to destroy him. His assets were frozen pending litigation. His reputation in the venture capital world was shredded overnight. Colleagues he'd known for years stopped returning his calls. One former friend sent a single text, "You chose the wrong side." Marcus had expected backlash, but the isolation was sharper than he'd imagined. What he hadn't expected was the groundswell of support from people he'd never met. Within 48 hours of the story breaking, a crowdfunding campaign appeared online, organized by former Cross Technologies employees and labor advocacy groups. The goal was to cover Marcus's legal fees and support the workers threatened with termination. It raised $37,000 in the first day. Letters poured in. Emails, handwritten notes, messages on social media, from people thanking him for standing up, for risking everything, for proving that someone with power could still choose decency. One letter came from a woman named Clara Mantes, a quality assurance specialist who'd been on the termination list. She wrote, "I have 3 kids. I couldn't afford to lose this job. You didn't have to do this, but you did. That matters more than you know." Marcus kept that letter folded in his wallet. The third-party review predictably stalled. The firm Julian hired to conduct it was a consulting group with ties to the company's law firm. Their preliminary findings were vague, non-committal, designed to buy time. But Marcus had allies now. Alana Bryce, the labor attorney, had taken on the case pro bono and assembled a team of lawyers who specialized in employment discrimination and whistleblower protection. They filed motions, subpoenaed documents, and pushed for depositions. The Labor Board's investigation gained traction. Reporters continued digging, and slowly the pressure mounted. By mid-October, cracks began to show. 2 board members resigned, citing concerns about the company's legal exposure. A senior vice president in HR leaked an internal memo that contradicted Julian's public statements about the terminations. The acquisition talks that Julian had bet everything on quietly fell apart, with potential buyers citing unresolved governance issues. Cross Technologies was bleeding value, and Julian was losing control. Marcus, meanwhile, was living in a cramped sublet in Brooklyn, surviving on savings and the occasional freelance consulting gig. His legal bills were mounting faster than the crowdfunding could cover. He spent his days in depositions, his nights reviewing case files. He was exhausted, broke, and more certain than he'd ever been that he'd made the right choice. One evening, as he sat at his borrowed desk reviewing testimony transcripts, his phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. "Meet me tomorrow, 8 a.m., Riverside Park, North End. Come alone." No name, no explanation. Marcus stared at the screen, weighing the risk, then replied, "I'll be there." The next morning was cold, the kind of October chill that cuts through jackets and settles in your bones. Marcus arrived early, hands shoved in his pockets, breath misting in the air. He spotted the figure on a bench near the waterfront, a man in a dark coat, mid-50s, graying at the temples. As Marcus approached, the man stood and extended a hand. "Paul Hendricks, former CFO at Cross Technologies. I left 2 years ago." Marcus shook his hand, cautious. "Why are you here?" "Because Julian's going to try to bury you, and I have the files that can stop him." Paul sat back down, gesturing for Marcus to join him. "I worked with Julian for 8 years. I helped build that company. I also watched him cut corners, silence dissent, and sacrifice people to pad his margins. When I pushed back, he forced me out. I signed an NDA, took my severance, and told myself it wasn't my problem anymore." He paused, his jaw tightening. "But you made it my problem again. You reminded me what it cost to stay silent." Paul pulled a thumb drive from his pocket and handed it to Marcus. "This contains financial records that show Julian personally authorized the termination strategy. It also includes emails proving he knew about the safety violations and chose to ignore them. If your lawyers can get this into evidence, it's game over." Marcus took the drive, his hand steady despite the adrenaline flooding his system. "Why risk it?" Paul looked out at the water, his expression distant. "Because I have a daughter. She's 26, just starting her career. I want her to work in a world where people like you exist, where someone with power actually uses it for something other than themselves." He stood, buttoning his coat. "Good luck, Marcus. Don't let them win." The files Paul provided were a turning point. Alana and her team used them to file an amended complaint that included detailed evidence of Julian's direct involvement in the termination scheme. The labor board escalated the investigation. Media coverage intensified. And then, in early November, Julian made a mistake. He agreed to a televised interview with a prominent business journalist, confident he could spin the narrative back in his favor. Instead, he came across as dismissive, evasive, and contemptuous of the employees he'd tried to fire. When the journalist asked if he regretted the decision, Julian said, "I regret that it became a distraction." The clip went viral. Within 24 hours, 3 more board members called for his resignation. A coalition of shareholders filed a motion to remove him as CEO, and Cross Technology's remaining acquisition prospects evaporated entirely. Julian was done, even if he didn't know it yet. Marcus watched the interview from his sublet, alone, except for a mug of cold coffee and the hum of the radiator. He didn't feel triumphant. He felt tired. But when his phone buzzed with a text from Clara Mendez, "We're still here because of you," he allowed himself a small, weary smile. The fight wasn't over, but the tide had turned.
By late November, Cross Technologies was hemorrhaging. Stock value had cratered. The labor board had issued preliminary findings supporting the employees' claims. Julian's legal team was scrambling to negotiate a settlement before the case went to trial. And Marcus, against all odds, was still standing. The company offered a settlement in early December. Reinstatement and back pay for all employees on the termination list, a formal apology, policy reforms, and a payment to Marcus to cover his legal fees and damages. Julian would resign as CEO, though he'd retain a minority stake in the company. It wasn't perfect, but it was a win. Alana called Marcus the morning the offer came through. "You did it," she said, her voice bright with exhaustion. "You actually did it." Marcus sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the past 3 months settling over him like a blanket. "What happens to them now?" he asked. "The employees, they go back to work. They get paid. They get protections. You gave them that." Alana paused. "And you? You get to decide what comes next." Marcus didn't have an answer yet. He'd spent so long fighting that he hadn't thought about what came after. The settlement was finalized 2 weeks later in a conference room that felt nothing like the boardroom where this had all started. Marcus signed his name, shook hands with lawyers he'd never see again, and walked out into the cold December afternoon. He stood on the sidewalk for a long time, watching people rush past with shopping bags and scarves, lives untouched by the battle he'd just fought. Then his phone buzzed. It was an email from David Tran, the compliance officer who'd been fired months before the purge. The subject line read, "Thank you, and one more thing." The email contained an invitation, a gathering at a community center in Queens, organized by former and current Cross Technologies employees. A celebration, David called it, a chance to meet the people Marcus had fought for, to see the faces behind the names on the list. Marcus almost declined. He wasn't good at crowds, at gratitude, at being the center of attention. But something, maybe exhaustion, maybe curiosity, maybe the need to see that this had all meant something, made him reply, "I'll be there." The community center was a modest brick building tucked between a laundromat and a bodega, the kind of place that hosted ESL classes and neighborhood meetings. Marcus arrived at 6, clutching a bottle of wine he'd picked up at the corner store, feeling absurdly out of place. Inside, the room was warm and loud, filled with people laughing, talking, kids running between tables laden with potluck dishes. A banner hung across the back wall. "Thank you, Marcus Reeves." He froze in the doorway, overwhelmed until someone called his name. Clara Mendez appeared at his side, the woman who'd written him the letter. She was small, mid-40s, with kind eyes and a firm handshake. "You came," she said, smiling. "I wasn't sure you would." "I wasn't sure either," Marcus admitted. Clara laughed and took the wine bottle from his hands. "Come on, there are people who want to meet you." She led him into the crowd, introducing him to faces and stories he'd only known as names on a spreadsheet. There was Miguel, a warehouse supervisor with 2 college daughters, Trisha, a customer support rep who'd been raising her grandson alone, Jerome, a quality assurance analyst who'd filed 3 safety complaints in 6 months. Each one thanked him. Each one told him what the settlement meant. Rent paid, insurance maintained, dignity restored. Marcus listened, nodded, shook hands, and felt something unfamiliar loosening in his chest. David Tran found him near the food table, holding a paper plate piled with empanadas and pasta salad. "You look shell-shocked," David said. "I didn't expect this," Marcus said. "What? Gratitude? You saved people's lives, man. What did you think would happen?" David clapped him on the shoulder. "You're a hero, whether you like it or not." Marcus shook his head. "I'm not a hero. I just couldn't look the other way." "That's what makes you one." David's expression softened. "Most people in your position would have stayed quiet, kept their money, kept their status. You didn't. That's rare. That matters." Later, as the evening wound down and the crowd thinned, Clara pulled Marcus aside. "Can I show you something?" she asked. She led him to a corner of the room where a corkboard had been set up, covered in photos and notes. "We asked everyone to bring something, a picture, a memory, a piece of their story, so you could see what you fought for." Marcus stepped closer. There were family photos, kids at birthday parties, graduation ceremonies, holiday dinners. There were notes scrolled in different handwriting. "My daughter starts college next fall. I can help her now. I didn't lose my house. I still have my health insurance. My mom's treatments continue." One photo showed a young boy holding a drawing of a superhero. The caption read, "My dad says you're like Superman. Thank you for helping him." Marcus stared at the board, his throat tight. He'd spent 3 months buried in legal documents and depositions, fighting abstract battles in windowless rooms. These faces, these lives, was what it had all been for. Clara stood beside him, quiet. "You gave us more than our jobs back," she said. "You gave us proof that someone cared, that we weren't disposable." She paused, then added, "That's worth more than you know." Marcus nodded, not trusting himself to speak. He stayed at the community center until nearly midnight, long after the last guests had left, helping Clara and David fold tables and sweep floors. They talked about the future, the policy reforms at Cross Technologies, the new leadership, the hope that things might actually change. When Marcus finally stepped out into the cold December night, his hands ached from stacking chairs and his heart felt lighter than it had in years. He walked to the subway, the city alive around him with late-night energy and distant sirens. His phone buzzed. Another message, this one from David Tran, the compliance officer who'd been fired months before the purge. The subject line read, "Just heard, Julian's officially out. New CEO announced tomorrow. You did it, Marcus. All the way." Marcus read the message twice, then slipped his phone back into his pocket. He didn't feel victorious. He felt relieved, tired, and strangely, unexpectedly, hopeful. As the subway rattled downtown, Marcus thought about the past 3 months, the meetings, the lawsuits, the fear and exhaustion and doubt. He thought about Julian Cross, once a man he'd admired, now a casualty tale about what happened when ambition consumed everything else. And he thought about the people he'd met tonight, the faces on the corkboard, the lives that had continued because he'd refused to stay silent. It hadn't been easy, it hadn't been safe, but it had been right. And in a world that often rewarded the opposite, that was enough.
Spring came slowly to New York, thawing the city block by block. Marcus spent the winter rebuilding his life piece by piece. The settlement had covered his legal fees and provided enough to stabilize his finances, but his reputation in the venture capital world remained radioactive. Doors that had once opened easily now stayed shut. Former colleagues avoided him at industry events. His name, once synonymous with success, had become a warning. Don't cross the line. Don't bite the hand. Don't be Marcus Reeves. He could have been bitter. Instead, he found himself strangely liberated. In February, he started consulting for nonprofits and worker advocacy groups, using his financial expertise to help organizations that had never been able to afford someone like him. He advised unions on pension negotiations, reviewed labor contracts for hidden pitfalls, and trained employee resource groups on how to navigate corporate power structures. The work paid a fraction of what he'd once made, but it felt purposeful in a way his old life never had. He slept better. He smiled more. He started running again early mornings through Prospect Park, his breath misting in the cold air. One afternoon in March, he received a call from Patricia Kim, the board member who'd been the first to push back during the fateful meeting. She was now interim CEO of Cross Technologies, tasked with cleaning up Julian's mess and rebuilding the company's culture. "I want to hire you," she said without preamble, "not as an executive, as an advisor. Help me make sure this never happens again." Marcus hesitated. The idea of returning to Cross Technologies, even in a limited capacity, felt complicated. But Patricia pressed on. "You proved you'll tell the truth even when it costs you. That's exactly what we need right now. I'm not asking you to come back to the board. I'm asking you to help me build something better." Marcus thought about it for 3 days. He talked to David, to Clara, to Alana. They all said the same thing. "You've earned the right to choose. Whatever you decide, it's the right call." In the end, Marcus said yes, on one condition. "I want a seat at the table for the employees," he told Patricia. "Not symbolic. Real representation. A worker advisory council with input on policy decisions." Patricia didn't hesitate. Done. Marcus started in April, working 2 days a week from Cross Technologies headquarters in Midtown. It was strange walking those halls again, past the boardroom where he'd made his stand, past the offices where people had once whispered about his betrayal. But the whispers had changed now. They said things like, "Thank you, and we're glad you're here." The company had changed too. Julian's top lieutenants were gone, replaced by leaders who prioritized transparency and accountability. The Worker Advisory Council launched in May, chaired by Clara Mendez. Marcus attended the first meeting as an observer, sitting in the back while employees raised concerns, proposed solutions, and held leadership accountable. Watching Clara run the meeting, confident, organized, unafraid, he felt something close to pride. In June, Marcus received an unexpected email. The subject line read, "Coffee?" The sender was Julian Cross. Marcus stared at the screen, weighing whether to delete it unread. Curiosity won. The email was brief. "I know I'm the last person you want to hear from, but I owe you a conversation. No agenda, just honesty. Meet me if you're willing." Marcus thought about ignoring it. He thought about the lawsuits, the countersuit, the months of hell Julian had put him through. Then he thought about the person Julian had been when they first met. Brilliant, driven, not yet corroded by his own ambition. He replied, "Saturday, 10 a.m., public place." They met at a coffee shop in the West Village, neutral ground far from the corporate towers that had once defined both their lives. Julian arrived early, looking diminished in a way Marcus had never seen. Thinner, grayer, the easy confidence replaced by something quieter. They ordered coffee and sat outside, despite the heat, the city humming around them. For a long time, neither spoke. Then Julian said, "I was wrong." Marcus waited. "I convinced myself it was just business, that the numbers mattered more than the people, that I was making hard decisions for the greater good." Julian's voice was flat, almost clinical. "But the truth is, I stopped seeing them as people. They were just variables in an equation, and by the time you called me on it, I was too far gone to care." He looked up, meeting Marcus's eyes. "You cost me everything, my job, my reputation, my wealth, and you were right to do it." Marcus didn't know what to say. He had imagined this conversation 100 times, angry, triumphant, vindicated. But sitting across from Julian, all he felt was tired. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked. "Because you deserve to hear it, and because I need to say it out loud." He paused. "I don't expect forgiveness. I don't even know if I deserve another chance, but I wanted you to know that I see it now, what I did, what I became." He finished his coffee and stood. "For what it's worth, you were the best thing that happened to that company, even if I couldn't see it at the time." Julian left without waiting for a response. Marcus sat alone, staring at the empty chair across from him, wondering if people could really change or if they just learned to live with the weight of who they'd been. He didn't have an answer, but he hoped, quietly, that change was possible. Summer turned to fall. Marcus's consulting work grew. The Worker Advisory Council at Cross Technologies became a model that other companies started to adopt. Clara Mendez was promoted to Senior Quality Assurance Manager. David Tron returned to Cross Technologies as Director of Compliance, hired personally by Patricia. Miguel's daughters both graduated college. Trisha's grandson started kindergarten. The lives Marcus had fought for continued, ordinary and precious. One October evening, a year after the boardroom confrontation that had started everything, Marcus received a package. Inside was a framed photo, the corkboard from the community center, the one covered in pictures and notes. A card was taped to the back. "You gave us our lives back. We wanted you to remember why it mattered. With gratitude always, the Crosstech Workers Council." Marcus hung the photo in his apartment, above his desk where he could see it every morning. On days when the work felt hard, when the isolation of his choices weighed heavy, he looked at those faces and remembered. Late that night, sitting at his kitchen table with a cup of tea and the city lights glowing beyond his window, Marcus thought about the question Clara had asked him a year ago. Why risk it? He'd answered then with something vague, something about principle and conscience. But the real answer, the one he'd only understood through living it, was simpler. Because someone had to, and I was in a position to do it. That was all heroism ever really was, not grand gestures or selfless martyrdom, but the willingness to act when acting mattered, even when the cost was steep. Marcus picked up his phone and scrolled to his messages. He typed, "Thank you for trusting me, for reminding me what matters, for making this year worth every hard choice." He sent it to Clara, to David, to Alana, to Patricia. Then he set the phone down, finished his tea, and went to bed. Tomorrow he had work to do. A union contract to review, a policy meeting to attend, a world to help make a little less cruel. It wasn't the life he had planned, but it was, he realized, the life he had been meant for all along. And that was enough.